In the early 1990s, archaeologists excavating burial sites in the Tarim basin of western China made a discovery that no one in the field was prepared for. Beneath the sand of one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth, in a region so remote it barely appears in most world histories, they found mummies. Not unusual in itself. What was unusual was what the mummies looked like. Tall, long-limbed, with hair that was not black, but auburn, red, and blonde, with facial features that did not belong anywhere near Central Asia. The textiles wrapped around them were woven in patterns that matched techniques from Bronze Age Europe, not from anywhere in the ancient East. They lay in the Taklamakan Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, preserved for over 4,000 years by the arid conditions, and they looked, to the archaeologists who found them, like they had walked out of a European past and ended up, inexplicably, in the wrong half of the world. The Chinese government restricted access to the remains for years. The political implications of ancient European-looking people, buried deep inside Chinese territory, were not simple to navigate. But the scientific questions kept pressing. Who were these people? Where had they come from? And what were they doing 4,000 years ago in a desert at the heart of the Eurasian landmass? When the DNA finally spoke, the answer was more complicated, more ancient, and more consequential than anyone had predicted. To understand what the Tarim mummies are, you first need to understand where they are. The Tarim Basin is a vast depression in what is today the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, ringed by three of the world's great mountain ranges, the Tian Shan to the north, the Kunlun to the south, the Pamir Plateau to the west. At its center sits the Taklamakan Desert, a name that translates from the local Uyghur as something close to, "You go in and you don't come out." The climate is extreme. Summers exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Winters drop far below freezing. Annual rainfall in some parts measures less than 10 millimeters. And yet people lived there. Along the edges of the basin, fed by glacial rivers descending from the mountains, there were oases, enough water to support communities, enough grass to graze animals, enough shelter from the wind to build settlements that lasted centuries. The Silk Road would eventually run through this basin, connecting China to the Mediterranean world. But the Tarim mummies predate the Silk Road by more than a millennium. The oldest of them, discovered at sites including Shaohe and Kaurikul, date to around 2000 BCE. The most well-known, a woman who came to be called the Beauty of Lulan, died approximately 4,000 years ago. She was tall, with light brown hair, high cheekbones, and a facial structure that physical anthropologists consistently describe as Caucasoid in the precise technical sense, meaning resembling populations from Western Eurasia rather than East Asia. She was buried with a woven basket, grain, and what appeared to be medicinal herbs. She was wrapped in woven wool, and she looked nothing like the Chinese populations who would eventually come to inhabit the region around her. The academic world took notice slowly. The political world took notice faster, and with considerably more anxiety. The first serious scientific attention came from Victor Mayer, a professor of Chinese language and literature at the University of Pennsylvania, who encountered the mummies in the early 1990s and spent the following years campaigning for access to DNA analysis that Chinese authorities were reluctant to permit. The cultural and nationalist dimensions of the discovery were immediately apparent to everyone involved. The Uyghur people of Xinjiang, a Turkic Muslim minority who have faced severe repression from the Chinese state, pointed to the mummies as evidence of their own ancient claim to the land. Chinese authorities, by contrast, emphasized that the mummies predated any Uyghur presence in the region and could not be used to support separatist arguments. Both interpretations were using the same bones to argue different cases, and neither of them was quite right, because neither of them knew what the DNA was going to say. The first mitochondrial DNA analyses, conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, with the limited samples that were permitted, suggested Western Eurasian ancestry. Haplogroups associated with populations from Europe and Western Asia appeared in the results. This seemed to confirm what the physical characteristics had already suggested, but the analysis was incomplete. The sample sizes were small, the methodology was constrained by the conditions of access, and the full picture remained out of reach. It would take until 2021 for the picture to fully come into focus. And when it did, it didn't just answer the question of who the Tarim mummies were. it raised an entirely new set of questions about the deep human past. In 2021, a team of researchers led by geneticists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig and Jilin University in China published a comprehensive whole genome analysis of 13 Tarim Basin mummies, including some of the oldest, in the journal Nature. The study was the most complete genetic analysis of these remains ever conducted, and the results dismantled both the prevailing academic hypothesis and the competing political narratives simultaneously. The prevailing academic hypothesis at the time was that the Tarim mummies were migrants from the Pontic steppe, the vast grassland north of the Black Sea that was home to the Yamnaya culture, the Bronze Age pastoralists, whose explosive expansion across Eurasia had spread the Indo-European languages from India to Ireland. The Yamnaya had been on the move. Their genetic signature appeared across much of Eurasia. It seemed logical that some branch of this expansion had pushed east into Central Asia and eventually into the Tarim Basin. The DNA said otherwise. The Tarim mummies were not Yamnaya. They were not migrants from the Pontic steppe. They shared almost no ancestry with any of the populations that were expanding across Eurasia during the Bronze Age. Instead, their genome pointed to something older, something that had no clear living descendants anywhere in the world today. The closest match the researchers could identify was an ancient population called the Ancient North Eurasians, a ghost lineage, known primarily from a single individual, a boy who died 24,000 years ago at a site called Malta in Siberia, and whose genome had previously revealed an unexpected connection between ancient Siberians and Western Eurasians. The Tarim mummies were, in the most precise genomic sense, a population that had survived in isolation for thousands of years. While the rest of Eurasia was mixing, merging, migrating, and transforming through the enormous demographic upheavals of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, the ancestors of the Tarim people had been sealed off, genetically sealed, in their mountain-ringed desert basin, from the rest of the human world. They were not migrants who had arrived in the Tarim Basin from somewhere else. They had been there, or in the region immediately adjacent, for so long that they had lost virtually all genetic connection to the mixing events that had reshaped every other population around them. The researchers used a specific term for what they found. They called the Tarim population an isolated relict, a human group that had preserved in near-perfect biological amber a genetic profile that had otherwise almost entirely ceased to exist anywhere on Earth. Think about what this means in concrete terms. While the Yamnaya were spreading across the steppe, while Anatolian farmers were moving into Europe, while Bronze Age cultures were rising and collapsing and rising again across the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and South Asia, a community of people in the Tarim Basin was living in extraordinary isolation, maintaining a genetic heritage so ancient that its nearest known relative was a boy who had died 10,000 years before them on the other side of Siberia. Their DNA was a living archive of a world that had otherwise vanished, and their material culture was equally extraordinary. The textiles recovered from the Tarim burials are among the finest and most technologically sophisticated fabrics from the ancient world, woven in plaid patterns, decorated with techniques that appear nowhere else in Asia at that time, but that show structural similarities to Bronze Age textiles from the Hallstatt culture of Austria. The hats were tall and conical. The boots were leather. The grave goods included horses, cattle, and dairy products, a pastoral economy that had no obvious local antecedent in the archaeological record of the region. Most striking of all, and most significant for the history of language, is what the mummies may represent in terms of the spread of the Indo-European language family. The Tarim Basin is today home to speakers of Tocharian, an extinct Indo-European language known from manuscripts discovered in the early 20th century. Tocharian is linguistically archaic in ways that have long puzzled scholars. Its closest relatives appear to be not the languages of Central Asia or South Asia, but the Celtic and Italic languages of Western Europe, suggesting an extremely ancient divergence from the Indo-European trunk. Some researchers have proposed that the Tocharian speakers, or their linguistic ancestors, arrived in the Tarim Basin very early in the spread of Indo-European, before the family had diversified into its major branches. The DNA does not prove this, but it is consistent with it. A population so isolated, so ancient, so genetically distinct from the steppe cultures that are usually credited with spreading Indo-European, could have carried an early form of the language into the Tarim Basin through a route and at a time that existing models have not fully accounted for. The language question remains open. The genetic question, in its broad outlines, has been answered, and the answer has changed what we thought we understood about the ancient world. The political dimensions of the discovery have not been resolved by the science, because science and politics are asking different questions. The Chinese government has at times claimed the research supports the view that the mummies were indigenous to the broader territory of what is now China, not migrants from the West, and therefore cannot be used to support any notion of Uyghur historical claim. Uyghur advocates have pointed out that the same research demonstrates the Tarim Basin has a human history far older and more complex than any single ethnic or national narrative can contain. Both of these readings miss the deeper point, which is that the Tarim mummies belong to a people who no longer exist as a distinct population anywhere. They were absorbed, over subsequent millennia, into the broader mixing of Central Asian peoples that eventually produced the region's historical populations. Their genetic heritage lives on only as a diluted trace in the genomes of various Central and East Asian populations. They were not the ancestors of the Uyghurs. They were not the ancestors of the Han Chinese. They were something else entirely, something older, something that the Bronze Age world eventually swallowed whole. There is a moment that the researchers describe in their published paper that I have not been able to stop thinking about. When the genomic analysis confirmed the extreme isolation of the Tarim population, one of the lead scientists noted that this degree of genetic insularity, maintained over such a long period, in a region that was not geographically sealed, but was surrounded by active, mobile, interconnected Bronze Age cultures, was deeply unexpected. Populations that isolated typically resulted from small founding groups on islands, or in extreme geographic refugia. The Tarim Basin was neither. It was surrounded by steppes, mountains, and trade routes that connected the ancient world. And yet the people there had not mixed. For generations beyond counting, they had stayed. They had maintained something, deliberately or by circumstance, that every other Bronze Age population was losing. A genetic wholeness, a connection to a world that was disappearing everywhere else, that the desert had somehow allowed them to keep. What the DNA tells us is that the history of the ancient world was not a single story of expansion and replacement. It was also a story of holding still, of survival in isolation so complete that it preserved, in the molecules of the dead, a record of what the human world once looked like before the great mixings of the Bronze Age erased it almost everywhere. The Tarim mummies were never simply Bronze Age Europeans lost in Asia, as the early and most sensationalist accounts described them. They were something stranger and more significant. The last representatives of an ancient lineage, preserved by the most hostile environment on Earth, carrying in their genomes a chapter of human prehistory that would otherwise have been lost entirely. History is not only written in the languages of the living, sometimes it is preserved in the silence of a desert, in the dryness that mummifies and the cold that keeps, waiting for a science patient enough and precise enough to finally read what was always there. The Tarim mummies were never what we thought, and the ancient world they came from was far older, far more isolated, and far more complex than any map we have drawn of it has yet managed to show.